cost of fuel is rising everywhere.
Gas prices could soon be on the rise.
Gas prices, they are going back up.
Gas prices continue to skyrocket nationwide.
The average American household would spend $2,800 on gas just a year ago, but today they're spending almost twice that amount. And there are a number of factors that have caused this. The most important is probably the increased geopolitical tensions across the world. But this made me wonder, how do today's fuel prices compare to that of the past? How much did fuel cost a few decades or centuries ago, or even a few millennia ago? So how concerned should we be about these rising prices? Would it just mean an increase in our travel costs, or would it trigger a complete economic collapse? That's exactly what I want to explore in today's video. So subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and let's get into it. Let's start at the very beginning, at a time without cars, planes, or trains. This is when people would move around in horses or ox carts, so the fuel in those times would be stuff like hay, oats, and other fodder. Now this sounds relatively cheap, right? But if you look at the medieval records on prices, you'll find something really interesting. Buying an ox or horses isn't what prevented most ordinary people from owning one. Rather, it was the cost of maintaining one. For instance, in 14th century England, a pack horse could cost about 5 shillings. This was worth about half a month of work or 15 days of work for your average medieval laborer, who would earn about 4 pence a day. Just for comparison, on the higher end, a courser horse, which would be used for nobles for hunting and stuff like that, would cost about 10 pounds. For the sake of comparison, this would cost an average laborer about 600 days of wages. So that's almost 2 years worth of work, and not something probably a typical laborer would go for. So let's stick with the assumption that they're gonna go with half a month's of wage behind a horse. Now, this was expensive, but it was still possible for them to buy if your family pooled their money together. I mean, think about it in today's standards. Spending half a month's of salary on a full car, that actually sounds really cheap. The thing was that it was expensive to maintain the horse. That's where the cost came in. Pasture wasn't always available and virtually inaccessible in wintertime. And a horse would almost require 2 pennies of hay daily. So half of the laborer's wage would be eaten away, literally. Only nobles or merchants could afford to give their horses oats, which would have cost about 5.5 pennies daily. These figures also reveal that knights and nobles, especially those earning handsomely for that time, would probably also think about expenses as quite high. On top of their weapons and an armor, a knight also had to maintain 4 war horses for campaigns, an ordinary riding horse for daily travel, and 3 to 4 pack horses. So even for a high earner like someone like a knight, feeding their horses would actually cost about half of their income, which was about 40 pounds. So yeah, quite expensive to maintain the fuel costs. Now, we talked about fuel for transportation like horses. Now let's talk about another type of fuel that was used for heating. In medieval Europe and Western countries, this was a significant expense, especially during wintertime. One of the main sources of heating fuel was charcoal. A bushel, or about 30 pounds of it, would cost almost 4 pence. And this made it just affordable enough for the common person for essential needs, like cooking. Oil deriving from plant or animal-derived products were far more expensive. 30 pounds of it could cost you about 4.3 shillings. Again, if you compare all of this to an average earning of a medieval farmer, the costs are sky high. Now, these examples that I just talked about are true for most of human history, so let's fast forward a little bit and start at the 18th century. And around this time, one event would permanently change the course of our society, and that is the Industrial Revolution. Since then, fossil fuels have come to dominate virtually every aspect of our lives. And early on, geography and proximity played a pretty big role in how expensive these fuel were. It was cheaper to buy fuel for regions that were closer to the source or connected to ports or railways. For example, in 1700, the price of coal was 258 pence per ton in London. However, in Guildford, which was much less connected, the price was 286 pence per ton, a significantly higher price at the time. It's also important to note that amongst other factors, coal prices may have influenced which countries were the first to industrialize. And this is supported by empirical evidence if we were to go by the coal price to wage ratio. According to this study, countries with a low coal price to wage ratio experienced higher manufacturing output and therefore higher growth. To put it simply, for some countries, it was difficult to industrialize because it was too expensive for its population. However, eventually, even in coal-producing countries, the cost was rising by the turn of the 20th century. By then, however, the world was beginning to shift to another resource: oil. Surprisingly, it is only by the 1950s that we start to see oil surpassing coal as the world's main fuel source. Yet, despite the rising demand, oil was cheap, and its prices were actually falling until the oil shock of 1973. In 1950, the median American household income was $3,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's just over $37,000 in today's value, which meant that a person could buy just over 1,100 barrels of oil with that money. And if you compare that to today, this would only buy you 922 barrels of oil, even though the median household income is now more than double. The absolute peak in oil prices was in June of 2008, when the world entered a terrible recession. Adjusted for inflation, the median household income back then was just over $73,000. Yet, this sum would only buy them 376 barrels of oil. Thankfully, that level of oil price increase was only temporary. So if you look at oil prices today, you'll notice that supply hasn't kept up with demand. This, coupled with rising political tensions, could lead to a more sustained price hike. So what happens in that kind of scenario? Well, for starters, it would lead you to more than just your daily commute becoming more expensive. For example, our goods are also transported by ships, planes, and vehicles running on oil. So higher oil prices would mean higher costs of household goods and basic needs. As the prices of goods increase, many service industries like hotels, restaurants, and healthcare would also become more expensive. This, in turn, could all lead to less household spending, because when prices are high, people tend to pull back and save their money, understandably so. And that, in turn, could lead to a risk of a recession because people would cut back on non-essential spending. If you look at fuel costs over time, from medieval times to modern times, you'll notice that these costs have actually shaped history. Fuel shapes history. And if you look at modern times with the threat of climate change, we simply cannot rely on finding more oil reserves to sedate our growing consumption. Again, fuel costs is shaping modern history. Now, because fuel costs has such a big impact on our lives, we should start thinking about how we live, rather than trying to find more resources and more fuel. I mean, the pandemic showed the world that we can make do with less travel and less reliance on fuel. Trends such as working from home should be more commonplace. Cities should be more walkable. Public transportation should be more accessible to improve the livelihoods of people and make them less reliable on fuel. Also, fuel costs has such a big impact on us, but yet we don't talk about how we can optimize to save better. I mean, look at supply chain optimization across the world. Globalization is great, it has its merits, don't get me wrong, but it also creates this sedated population blind to environmental costs sometimes. I mean, look at this cup of preserved pears. When you turn a blind eye to the choices of your consumption decisions, you end up with this item being grown in Argentina, packed in Thailand, and then sold back in the US. I don't know about you, but that seems excessive, and things like this makes fuel costs unreliable, and small things like this build up over time. I think that understanding how people look at fuel over time and how costs have evolved over time is very important. Understanding the history of fuel costs better help us understand the current cost of fuel and how it impacts our lives, our choices, and our future. If you like this video, I'm sure you'll like this video that I made about property ownership and how it worked in medieval times. So subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon.